My name is Maren Sæbø. I'm a journalist and a historian. And I did study the ANC as well. We have a very competent panel today. We have Rekgotsofetse, Chikane, joining us from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He has written a book on protest movements in modern South Africa. We have Tørres, which have
also quite competent.
Also quite competent, with a long history of both studying and working with also different, especially the unions, but also different parts of South African political movement. And we have Elling, Tjønneland, which has followed, I guess, South African politics since before I was born. So we hopefully we will be able to give you some of the highlights for the upcoming elections in May. And I will start with giving Dr. Chikane 10 minutes for his introduction to the whole theme.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this discussion today. Hopefully I get to the 10 minutes. I'm not sure if I'll hit that marker, but because there's a lot to say about South Africa over the last 30 years. So many of you may or may not know that South Africa is we are now in our 30th year of democracy. And whenever you hit these big milestones, it creates opportunities for people to start reflecting about how far we've come and where we want to go into the future. And it also happens to coincide with what is now being considered probably our most contentious election in modern day South Africa, in the sense of if there was a time for the ANC to possibly lose its majority, which I should be very clear, I personally don't think they'll lose the majority, but if there was a national election in which that opportunity would finally open up, it will probably be this election or the next one. And because of that, we're now starting to see a change in political culture in the country. We're starting to see a rise in confidence from opposition parties in particular. And a lot of this can kind of be traced back to what can be considered either the downfall of the ANC. I think it's very, very dramatic to say the ANC is falling when they still have a 57% majority in the country at a national level, and have a tight grip on pretty much 6 of the 9 provinces in the country. But that being said, we can also see that there's a weakening of internal ANC processes, weakening of internal ANC democratic practices, and a weakening of the ANC's mechanisms to hold its own officials accountable for acts of corruption. And we're seeing a culmination of that leading up to this opportunity of maybe they could lose, right? And so you can really trace this. I mean, we could talk about the Mandela years. I am part of what people like calling the born-free generation, those who are kind of born into a democratic South Africa. And I think it gives us a sense of like privilege, in the sense of like, we didn't have to live through it, but it also gives us an interesting perspective of we can judge the country based on what we see it. So during the Mandela years as a child, you always get given this idea that South Africa is quite unified, that we're filled with potential, that there's a lot that can happen. And that energy kind of carries into the 90s, into the early 2000s. And during the early 2000s, you see this kind of rapid economic growth in the country, right? So growing at 5 to 6%. What we also realize is that economic growth doesn't necessarily deal with the structural issues of the country. So even though your economy is growing, both unemployment, poverty, and inequality increases as well. And we're not talking about kind of minute levels of poverty and inequality and unemployment. We're talking about 30% of the country being unemployed. The vast majority of those being young people. We have about 4 million 18 to 35-year-olds who are not in employment, education, or training. We have still the most unequal country in the world, if you want to use the Gini coefficient to measure that. And we still have a country that has over 60% of the country living underneath the upper poverty line, right? So we can see that there are structures within the country that don't allow for change. And I think people started realizing that. And during the Mbeki years, even though there was this growth, there was this rise of, and these complexities about Zuma's rise, but you have Zuma essentially President Jacob Zuma essentially taking control of the party after the most contentious electoral conference that the ANC had in 2007. And why I mention that is that that essentially sets the tone for the next 15 years of the country, right? So Zuma gains power and essentially becomes president of the ANC and of the country. And during that time period, so between about 2009, 2018, we see many things happening. We see the economy stagnating. We see a rapid rise in protest activity across the country, to a protest a day. Most of these protests focused on service delivery issues, most of these protests being disruptive in nature, and not necessarily say that's a bad thing. It's just people utilizing their political voice in different political channels. But we see this rise of antagonism towards the state. We see a rise of antagonism towards the ANC. And then we see the first major loss of the ANC in electoral election at a local level, where they lose urban metros, right? So they lose the city of Johannesburg to their main opposition parties. And that sets the tone for opposition parties to say, if there was a time to really go at the ANC, it would be now. And we see a steady decline of the ANC going into the 2019 national elections. So they go from sitting at about 62%, just under 62%, if I'm not mistaken, to 57% in 2019. We see the rise of the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, which are considered a more kind of populist, revolutionary kind of party that really advocates towards young people in the country, who take advantage of the kind of disparity that young people have about the state of the nation. They sit at around 10%, which is a major growth for them. You see the Democratic Alliance, which is the main opposition party of the country, essentially holding tight with about 20% of the vote in 2019. And all of this within the context of the removal of Jacob Zuma and the replacement of Jacob Zuma with President Cyril Ramaphosa. And the idea of Ramaphosa was that he is the change maker. He came in underneath the slogan of the new dawn, essentially. This idea that we can rebuild this country, we can bring it out of what people, I think an unfair statement, but what people would describe as the lost decade of the country. And a lot of the work that Cyril Ramaphosa was focused on was kind of rebuilding institutions of accountability in the country. So our National Prosecuting Authority, our police services, our judicial system, this idea that we can't hold people accountable if the mechanisms to hold them accountable have essentially been policed by those who are the most corrupt in society. And then COVID-19 happens and essentially puts a stall to all of that. And then what we also realize is that even though you might have a new leader of the ANC, the internal factionalism within the ANC allows it to remain weak in the eyes of the electorate, allows it to remain weak in the eyes of opposition parties. So as we go into this election, what we are now seeing is that I kind of highlight four particular areas, and I might kind of end off there and add my last 2 cents on an issue about where the country may be going. Is that we know that in our country, we now have what we call the big three. There's the big three parties, and that would be the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters. By majority share, they have just around 75 to 80% of the vote, right? So they're there. Then you have the downfall of traditional opposition parties, or the stagnation of them, right? So we have our more nationalist traditional parties, being the Inkatha Freedom Party, so IFP, and the Freedom Front Plus. Both of these often associated along racial lines and ethnic lines, with the IFP being predominantly associated with Zulu individuals within the country. So Zulu will be an ethnic group within South Africa, and the Freedom Front Plus being associated with white Afrikaans individuals within the country. So they kind of have lost their prominence at a national election, but have remained their influence at quite a regional level, with the IFP being very interesting going into this next election. We then have this idea of we can't beat the ANC by ourselves, and that we need to create grand coalitions of opposition parties. A lot of this was actually influenced by donor funding, that donors realized that we need to tell all the opposition to come together, that this thing of each of you being funded by one of us and each of you fighting on your own doesn't make sense. And out of that, we get probably South Africa's first major pre-electoral coalition called the Moonshot Pact. And this is all the major small parties, including the DA, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, and a few other stakeholders I'll talk about just now, who've come together to essentially say, vote for any of us except the ANC, and we'll ensure that we will govern as a coalition, right? And that would not have happened 5 or 10 years ago because their voting share just wouldn't be there. I think now they feel a lot more confident about it. What we've also seen during this last 5 to 6 years is the rise of new political establishments and new political parties, right? And so one of them being very interesting, and I put them into 3 buckets. The first bucket would be kind of middle class and working class nationalism, which you can really be associated with a party such as Action SA. And these types of parties take advantage of urban areas who do not want to vote for the ANC, but also don't want to vote for the Democratic Alliance for various different reasons. And they gravitate towards Action SA because Action SA will say, we will fix the potholes, we'll fix the roads, but most importantly, we'll make sure that foreigners don't come into the country. You know, that type of political rhetoric of blame foreigners for all the nation's ills, right? But really targeted towards the middle class and working class. And I use the term middle class very loosely in South Africa. If you miss one paycheck, you can quickly go from middle class to poverty stricken. That's how bad our inequality is. And then you get populist organizations, the Operation Bundulas of the world, who are also going to be contesting our elections, not at a national level, but at a regional level. These are grassroots movements who are targeting foreigners again in particular, but use very populist rhetoric. Another equivalent of this would be the Patriotic Alliance, which for the longest time, and I don't know what the term would be in Norway, but for the colored community of South Africa, they've essentially lost a political party that truly represents them. And the Patriotic Alliance has decided to kind of use colored nationalism itself to try and get voters. This is a party that is led by a reformed gangster, but I don't know how else to describe him, but a reformed gangster, I guess. But he's gained great strides. And then you get new parties that are doing grassroots mobilization, such as Rise and Zanzi. And why I only mention them is that this is a brand new party that have gotten the most amount of funding, I think, in SA's history for a brand new party going into elections. And they use kind of grassroots mechanisms. So you have this change in political dynamics. And I think a lot of it is also around this idea of electoral reform in the country, which I can talk about a bit later, that people are steadily realizing that changes need to be made in the country. New parties are coming out. The ANC is falling steadily. They might fall underneath 50% in this next election. And these new players in our political discourse, which is forcing the culture of politics in the country to change. And all of this is coming to a head on the 29th of May, but will deeply play out in the country over the next 5 years as well. So let me leave it at that. I think that is my history of South Africa right now. Electoral perspective. Definitely missed out a ton of things, which are very, very important, but I'm pretty sure our esteemed panelists will cover the gaps as well.
Thank you, Dr. Chikane. I will just hand it over to Lee, because I know you have some opinions on both the time scope here and also some of the issues. He set the tone from Polokwane conference and to this, which Polokwane was a sort of a big conference that the ANC
coup of Zuma.
The coup of Zuma. But there's an ANC and also a president before that I know that you have some opinions about, qualified opinions.
Well, maybe I'll try and do a sort of very short wrap up of sort of my view of the history here. I was there 30 years ago. It makes me feel extremely old, of course, but I was there for the elections in '94 and very much part of the anti-apartheid movement inside, working with the trade unions. And I think it's important to understand as part of the background that the organized civil society at the time was a very important part of winning that victory of toppling apartheid. Yes, sanctions played a role, the ANC in exile played a role, and the economic situation in South Africa, the fact that the country was in a very bad shape financially. I mean, there were a lot of factors that played in behind the winning, the success of the anti-apartheid movement, but there's no doubt that there was a very, very strong internal civil society. I did surveys at the time, and we mapped the organizational density of Black South Africans at the time at sort of similar levels as Norway. So people were members of 3-4 organizations each. Now, very impressive. They were organized in unions, of course, church societies, organizations, civics, women's organizations. Then we won the battle. Apartheid fell. You know, I'm just going to try and wrap up here. ANC comes back from exile. And I think that's an important part of the background here for what we have seen afterwards. A very, very broad movement. Some of us had sort of expected the ANC, seeing that this was a liberation movement, and they were standing for equal rights and freedom, they would also be promoting very strongly democracy, all good things, human rights, democracy, build the party bottom up, etc. What we realized when the ANC took over, and of course this is a personal view, but the ANC was and is a very broad movement, and it sort of represents everything. But there's no doubt, I think, that who took over much of the power from the very beginning in '94 was very much the exiled side of the ANC, which wasn't organized as a democratic organization in exile. It was a military movement organized with command systems, control systems, hierarchies, and they were not all that happy about all aspects of democracy. Let me put it a bit bluntly. I remember some of the first papers that came out from the presidency were basically arguing that the unions that had to a large extent been leading the internal anti-apartheid movement, very well organized, very good leaders, bottom-up democratic movement. The unions, according to the ANC, 95, should basically now focus on collective bargaining, issues at the workplace, but stay out of politics. That was now the ANC that should run. So I think the point is, ANC was something else from what many of us expected. The internal democratic movement handed all the power over to the ANC, obviously. The ANC was trying to build a party, was struggling, has been struggling with internal conflicts ever since. And there was a reason why Zuma won the Polokwane coup in '97, because there was a very, very strong and growing criticism of Thabo Mbeki. Even Mandela was out criticizing Thabo Mbeki as a president several times. So we have seen these sort of conflicts and cleavages inside the ANC for a long time, and we see them still very, very strongly. Zuma, yes, was pushed out, but there's no doubt that you still have a very strong group linked to the old sort of Zuma Zuma group. And of course, the interesting thing for Norway maybe is that this is not so much a political group. We cannot really say. It will be interesting to hear your view on this as well, Dr. Chikane, but in my view, it's not possible to separate these internal groups in the ANC according to this is right wing or this group is left wing, or they have different ideologies. They have different economic interests. I mean, that's basically as sad and blunt as it is. The group that sort of developed around Zuma have economic interests in helping each other. And helping mostly each other and not the country. Sorry, that was probably too blunt, but
No, I don't think so.
now we hand it over to Elling.
Yeah, it's your take on this is are there inherently sort of tensions inside ANC that we now see coming for this election as well? How is the past impacting on the present, basically?
The ANC has a very long history, and it has almost disintegrated in various moments in history. ANC was very weak in the 20s and the 30s, came back in the late 40s. It was very weak, of course, after the repression in the 1960s and the 70s, came back in the 1980s. And it has been the big party ever since the 94 elections, generally about 60% of the vote. But it's a broad movement which has been characterized by all sorts of tensions, and as divisions within South Africa is deepening, divisions between poor and rich, between rural, urban, between the new provinces and so on, that will also manifest itself within the ANC. It will be increasingly difficult to maintain the strong party. What we've seen is that some very important developments are taking place in the support base of the ANC since '94. The African population is about 80%, perhaps 70% of the voters. And the ANC still commands the majority of support from that population, but they have largely lost the strong position they previously had among the colored population, 10% of the population, among the Indian population, and never been very strong among the white population. And more recently, over the past decade, they've been struggling with the urban middle class. They have been revolting, protesting against mismanagements, poor governance, growing corruption within the public sector. And that we don't know what this will lead to. It may, of course, end up in a situation, not now, 5 years, 10 years from now, that the ANC may implode, disappear from the scene, like the South African Party up to 1948, the National Party from 48 to 94, because they're not able to tackle the new challenges. But compared to the past, there is no strong alternative that can take over where the ANC is failing. So we don't know what's going to happen. But what will happen is that coalition politics will become much more important, and that will have dramatic impacts also on political culture and the way politics is conducted in South Africa. The ANC, I would guess, it still retains its position as a governing partner at the national level, but it will perhaps lose, or most likely lose, its majority in key provinces such as Gauteng, which is the economic heartland and most populous province in South Africa. It may also lose the KwaZulu-Natal, the second biggest province in South Africa, And that doesn't mean that it will disappear from governing position in those provinces, but its success will depend on its ability to build coalitions. And that's a challenge in South African politics. There are not really any trust between the big parties. And the situation is now that none of the three big parties will get a majority on their own, not even with coalitions. So they will have somehow to work together. And the history over the past 5 years is pretty poor when you look at the big cities, the metropolitan areas, where it has really been extremely difficult to agree on a workable solution, a coalition. What's been happening is that the EFF and the ANC has in many places agreed to rule together, but they don't agree on who should hold the key position as mayor. So there they turn to weak parties, small parties, weak individuals, and let them run, and then it collapses. If we can't read too much out of a single event, but yesterday the Metropolitan Council in Ekurhuleni, the big, huge city to the east of Johannesburg, there all parties agreed to elect the ANC candidate as a mayor. So that was, I think, one of the first times where the EFF and the ANC agreed that the ANC should be the mayor. So that could perhaps be a positive indication. But coalition politics also has a long history in South Africa. I mean, if you look at the 94 elections, I mean, the ANC, of course, had full control in all provinces except two, where it was a 30% party, Western Cape and the KZN, and they had very different approaches to coalition buildings to rule in those two provinces. In KZN, they succeeded. They had a very different approach in Western Cape, and they lost miserably.
Thank you. I think I know that Lee wants to comment on something, but I'm going to go further on to let Dr. Chikane comment on a couple of things first.
Sure.
Lee was mentioning that in 94, there was a strong organization at several levels, and people would be a member of several different organizations, and especially the unions. Today, I know you have done some work on more present social movements and the service delivery protests, Zuma must fall, that kind of protest movements, which are not apparently organized very tightly, but sort of a ad hoc or one issue kind of protests. How is is there still a potential for organizing from the grassroots up, also coming into elections? Is there any organizations that still has the potential to actually drive politics outside the political parties?
Yeah, so the long answer is right now, no. But there's a logic behind that. So indeed, there was a lot of organized mass mobilization by civil society and unions, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they essentially, I wouldn't say imploded, but was stopped and disencouraged. That's the word. They were told politely that we need to have a democratic country, and if you keep shouting at us, then we can't, do the work that we need to do. So you have this decline in civil society activism in the early 2000s after one real kind of upsurge of it. And then you also have the unions doing very interesting things of aligning themselves, at least the one major union that's the largest in the country, closely aligning itself with the ANC, right? So almost inhibiting its ability to be antagonistic to the ANC outside of ANC processes, if that makes sense. So this tri-apartheid alliance between COSATU, the ANC, and the South African Communist Party almost stops the unions from being able to criticize the ANC, because the ANC's response would be, why didn't you mention that in the meeting we had a couple of months ago, right? So it really stalls the activity. So you see this decrease of political activity. What we also see, and this is something me and my colleagues like to write about, that our mechanisms to hold government accountable, so public participation mechanisms, are not designed for contestation or deliberation. We are now finding out that they're almost exclusively designed for co-option, right? So we want you to kind of be in the room so we can check a list and say you were present. But our mechanisms are not designed to take civil society views into public policy processes. And you see this playing out through the kind of dead years of organization for civil society in the 2000s. And during that time, we then track an increase of protest activity, so informal public participation. And what we attribute that, there's a fantastic academic called Kate Alexandra who describes it as the rebellion of the poor. And essentially, it is this rapid increase of protest activity, unorganized at a local level in particular communities, that exponentially increases from about 2007 and onwards. The first time we see any form of coordination around type of antagonism is with the student protests in about 2015, called the Fees Must Fall protests, around a single issue, and that was organized among students in the country. What was unique about this is that it really threatened to put the country to a standstill. We see the evolution of this into the Zuma Must Fall protests, which is a fascinating thing that needs its own discussion in and of itself. But it is ordinary South Africans still not organized by one organization, right? Some people would claim that they can, right? But it's still kind of this motley crew of civil society trying to agitate for change. But the danger of that is that if you have mass mobilization of civil society protesting against the state that's unorganized, that doesn't necessarily have a leader, you could potentially utilize that energy for undemocratic practices. And we see that front and center in 2021 with the July unrests of 2 weeks, essentially, of chaos in the country, of massive amounts of looting, that people, we can't call it a protest, but is indicative of uncontrollable mass mobilization. And this is the danger that we're facing. So civil society has really struggled to make one common platform similar to the 1980s. There are definitely attempts to do it, but I think it's the structure of accountability mechanisms that don't incentivize that. There's also just not enough money in civil society coming in that allows us to mobilize with each other. And I think there's also old antagonisms within civil society between those who used to be leaders in the late 90s, early 2000s, vis-a-vis young leaders who are a bit more brash in their language. And these two groupings can't really come together a lot of the time. I think there's hope, but it makes it very, very difficult to do any sort of mass mobilization. However, I think this will change over the next 5 years.
I know Liv is dying to comment on this.
Yeah, it was very much this that I was thinking about when I asked for the word earlier. I think we talked about the elections and the fragmentation of the political landscape and all the sort of problems around the political parties and the ANC in particular. What worries me in particular is this area. Looking 30 years back, as I said previously, you had a very, very well-organized civil society. And by well-organized, I basically mean not only that people had membership in or were affiliated to 3-4 organizations each, but they were organized. I mean, they were really, it was a movement built from below. They had the unions are obviously the ones that I know best, but they had structures, they had the shop stewards, they had mandates, they elected their shop stewards. If the shop stewards didn't do what they had said, members had said they should do, they would call them back. It was it was a movement built from below. And I did surveys at the time, also mapping out how organized members of the unions were more active in other fora. They were more democratically oriented because they learned sort of the skills and the power of organizing and building a movement. Then comes the ANC in, and several things happened. One was we all totally trusted the ANC. So, you know, this was a democratic party. They were, you know, now they could take over. Now, there were no checks or very few checks and balances established at the time from the same civil society organizations that had led the struggle. They totally trusted this bunch of people coming back from the ANC. And some, you know, I still remember this very close friend of mine saying, we handed it over for free. You know, the sense that they had led the struggle, they had won the struggle, they had toppled apartheid. They handed it over to the ANC that came back from exile. They totally trusted them. And they themselves, the leadership of these organizations, many of these organizations were totally brain drained. All the leaders of the civil society organizations went to parliament, to the new institutions set up in all the sectors of the new democracy. COSATU itself took several years before it got, well, it never really got back to where it was. But the whole top leadership from regional levels, national levels, the separate unions that were members of COSATU, etc., they were all sort of, you know, they went to other jobs. And not because they wanted to leave the unions per se. It wasn't a sort of runaway thing. They totally trusted the ANC. They totally believed they now had a responsibility to fill other functions. And they totally trusted the situation. And they thought that there would be new leadership developing from the ground all the time. But it took years. And I think this is a big part of the explanation while civil society is now struggling also, because it was totally vacuumed after democracy was established. Now, there's a big difference between mobilization and organization in my view. You have mass mobilization regularly in South Africa. You got protest movements, they come and they go. Some of them manage to organize sort of or get together more successfully, but you don't have the same strong organizations that manage to topple apartheid. And without that, I fear that all the mobilization movements also become explosive, volatile, dangerous in many ways, and will not provide the kind of pillars we need also for democratic development or keeping the political parties on the right track. Because that is the function of civil society organizations, to serve as checks and balances on the governments, and they are not able to do that today properly. And yes, I always believe, you know, I like the idea that there is hope, but I think hope we should have, and I have, but really there has to be a serious sort of attempt at organizing civil society again in order to push the government, whoever is sitting there, and keep them accountable. Because without checks and balances and strong civil society organizations, very few governments deliver well.
What they need to deliver. You want to comment, Elling?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, the revolutionary days, there was a lot of mass mobilization. And at the time, also strong democratic organization in that mass mobilization of the 1980s and early 90s. But it's extremely difficult to sustain over time. And parties take over. And I think you might dismiss the ANC as a bunch of people coming in from exile, but ANC, they had very big support from the mass movement. And a lot of the people who came back were people from the mass movement that went into exile in the late 1980s. But ANC has the responsibility for failing to provide good governance. But the legacy, one of the legacies of the mass mobilization and strong civil society at the time was that South Africa managed to build up some strong institutions to protect that democracy. Very good constitutions, and many of the public institutions worked reasonably well, and that, in a sense, also helped to save South Africa. It could have been much worse. Shall I mention one final comment? Is that it's not just all bad in South Africa. There is a lively political debate. There is a strong new emerging political culture. And the ANC has also, the government has also made some important progress in a number of areas. And let me just single out one thing, and that is the de facto social safety nets for the extreme poor. So extreme poverty has not been eradicated, but drastically reduced, and that is largely to do with the introductions of a number of social grants. And today, about 25 million South Africans out of a population of, what is it, 62 million, are benefiting from social grants. Admittedly small, but what I see now is that there is an emerging consensus that this has to be transformed into a basic income grant. And I'm not surprised if that will be introduced over the next 5 years. Admittedly at a very low level, but it's very important to support the poor.
Short comment, Liv.
Very short. My point was not that the ANC didn't have support when I came back from exile. They had massive support. I was a member of the ANC. Everyone who was against apartheid was for the ANC. The point is the ANC that was established as inside the country as a democratic party started with 3 components. 1, the group that came out of prison. 2, the exile movement that came from outside. And 3, the internal ANC supporters. Now, out of these 3 groups, they were supposed to build a democratic party with branches and, you know. I think there's no doubt that the exiles took over a lot of the party from the beginning, and they did not have sort of the experience or maybe even the willingness to build a democratic party. But that's a longer discussion.
I'm sure these 3 guys they can talk for hours, but we do want to open up for some questions. There should be a microphone somewhere.
Thank you. My name is Siri Gloppen. This was extremely interesting. It was very inspiring, very interesting. And I have many questions, but I'll start with 2 questions. So one of the things that you said, Liv, it's like, I don't know, it's very important. You said that there is a big difference between mobilization and organization. And I think that's something that doesn't only go for South Africa, but that is part of the challenge of democracy currently. It's easy to mobilize. And with social media, it's getting easier and easier to mobilize, but organization is getting more difficult, maybe, or at least not easier. So I just want to challenge you, I mean, in the context of South Africa, how to achieve that. But also, I mean, more broadly, how do we achieve that? How do we go from mobilization to organization? Not that you have an answer, but I'd like to just hear your reflections, because I think it's such a crucial question in South Africa and more generally. And I'd like to hear all of you on that, actually. The other one was linked to sort of that I was thinking about throughout, and that also was linked to your last comment, Elling, was this sort of, in some ways, South Africa I mean, it's interesting in so many ways, but of course there was so much hope and so much disappointment also because there was so much hope. And of course, that means that we see the failures a lot, but there is something interesting because, I mean, when all of you are talking, I mean, we all think that there will be a next election, not only this one, but there will be a next one. There is something about the institutional stability that's, I mean, we never know the future, but there seems to be some sort of confidence in the democratic institutions that even though there is a really, there is a really, I mean, for sure, there is crisis in a way of governance, or is perceived to be a crisis of governance, but maybe not so much of democracy in a sense, that there is something about the democratic institutions. So I would like to hear if that is your views on that. And then sort of institutions like electoral institutions as such, the courts, maybe the legal institutions, do you see them as stable? Do you see them as sort of, how stable are they in the current situation?
I think we have one more question back there. Oh, yeah, there and there.
All right. So if we're talking about the end of the ANC, you know, one thing that perhaps I think should be addressed is the rise of the MK party, because the latest polling data I've seen is from last year, 2023, which pit the ANC at 38%, the EFF at 18%, and the DA at 17%. So that means if that polling data is to be believed, if we take that just one polling data, the MK is going to chip away at someone's vote. We don't know who, because President Zuma is addressing Afrikaners, white liberals in filled up venues, in addition to his original base. So when we discuss, I suppose, the end of the ANC, supposedly, if we factor this in, and we use this polling data as a point of departure, do we see the ANC surviving, or are we seeing another coalition? But just also to mention that the ANC itself is not just the ANC, it's a coalition, right? So it has never been a single party governing South Africa. It has always been a coalition. So those are some of the things I think that perhaps will get us to the point of, does the ANC survive? Particularly in view of the only one of the fundamental differences with the EFF is the whole land question, and of which they had previously agreed in Parliament, and then the ANC backed out quite late. So if they find each other on that, the ANC doesn't die and the ANC governs. Yeah.
We'll do the last question as well, and then I'll give each of you 3 minutes to answer all of them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Odd Fjelstad here from CMI. It will be very interesting to hear your response on the previous question related to the MK party. What do you think? Will it have a national role, or will it be mainly regional in KZN? But my question is more related to, there are, as you also point out, there are many factors which can explain or contribute to the decline of the support of the ANC. But as long as the majority of the black population supports ANC, then it's safe. Now we have seen a dramatic decline also in the support from the black population. How important has the service delivery challenges been in that respect? I'm thinking in particular about electricity, water, and that type of services, which really has hit the majority of the poor population, not only, well, all segments of the population, but particularly hard. It has hit the poor people very hard. How important has that aspect been in the seeming decline now in the support to the ANC among the black population. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll do the answers in reverse direction now. So we'll start with Elling, Lee, and then Dr. Chikane in the end. You don't have to answer all of the questions, everyone, but just
Really?
Let's you stop me after 3 minutes. Let's begin with the MK party, which is the party that was formed around Jacob Zuma, and that's really a wild card in these elections. Can't really imagine that will be an important national player in the sense that it will be a big party, but it is certainly going to get some support. It could be a factor in KwaZulu-Natal. And of course, a small party in parliament, 3, 4, 5%, can also be very important when it comes to coalition negotiations, if that were to happen. So the Zuma party will be with us for some time. Where they will take their support from is more interesting. There will, of course, the ANC will lose support in especially in KZN, but recent by-elections, municipal by-elections in that province and a stronghold of potentially stronghold of the Zuma party also indicates that a lot of the traditional support to the IFP may shift to Zuma. And it may also make it very difficult for the EFF to increase and to mobilize, because they are also seeking to get support from and mobilizing on the same issues. But Zuma party will be an important factor. Then the main swing away from the ANC in numerical terms has, of course, been the economic freedom fighters, and they mobilized among the youth, disaffected youth. And that's been around service delivery and lack of jobs and so on. So they've certainly made inroads there. And then it's the famous urban middle class. They have been growing disappointments with service delivery and poor governance and so on. But they go in different directions, and they don't go to a particular political party. The DA used to mobilize among urban Africans, but they lost a lot of that support to Action South Africa and people who left the DA. Okay.
It's your 3 minutes.
I believe Zuma's party is going to do well, not at the national level, but at the regional level. And Zuma is a very smart guy. Let me just sort of end that he's not gonna sort of lie down easily. And he's got a powerful group around him with a lot to lose, which is also an important part of this. Keep in mind that there's very heavy economic interests around these political groupings as well. Is service delivery an important reason why they are losing ground? I think there's no doubt about that, but lack of service delivery in combination with massive corruption. People are sick and tired of load shedding, electricity being turned on and off, now water being turned off in parts of South Africa. It's very closely linked, the service delivery problems with massive corruption. Now, I thought I had a relatively creative mind, not that I'm a thief, but I thought I knew how people were stealing money until I read the book of the previous ESCOM chief in South Africa, Truth to Power, I think it's called. And I was just amazed that there were so many ways of stealing money that, you know, we couldn't even imagine, that he was mapping out around electricity delivery in South Africa. And of course, you read the newspapers in South Africa, it's incredible. Corruption is massive, and that is closely linked to lack of service and all the delivery problems. Corruption in South Africa closely linked to tender processes, and yeah. Now, are the institutions stable? I think they are. And there's a lot of hope on my side in a very good court system, stable courts that are functioning, a press functioning, etc. So people get information, which is also, of course, an important part of why the ANC is now losing support when people see all the stories coming out over the years. What is more dangerous, as I said earlier, is the unorganized, possibly anarchy we have in a civil society that is not organized and disciplined. And how do we sort of turn that around? I think one of the most problematic points for me was the split in the trade union movement, because that was really a very strong pillar in civil society, COSATU. It let itself be split by political groupings, basically. There was intervention there was intervention from the ANC side, not being happy about COSATU criticizing the government at the time. And to cut a very long story short, COSATU was split. You now have two relatively big unions. Well, COSATU was still the biggest, SAFTU, the smaller one, the breakaway Confederation, both of them struggling. Both of them would have gained on getting back together and building a new trade union movement. I think, someone just needs to see the importance of building organizations again. And yes, there are some very promising movements also outside the unions, like I think they're called Abbaslale, the organization organizing people living in the squatter camps, etc., that I met some years back when I was in the Norwegian People's Aid, and they amazed me. Incredible. I mean, they are incredible. They're basically organizing people living in the squatter camps. So, there are several other smaller organizations that have developed. So maybe someone can build something out of that.
Yeah, that was about 4 minutes,
Yeah.
but I'll still give Dr. Chikane his 3 minutes.
I'll be fairly quick. So I think the conversation of mobilization versus organization is quite interesting. So I will, as someone who does work in civil society, I will say South African civil society is very organized. Whether we all work together is another question, and that's not because we don't want to. There's no incentive to do it. And I always preface this by saying I stopped saying that South Africa has an amazing constitution, because then it stops us from looking deeper into it. So after 30 years, we're now seeing the design flaws of the constitution that are not matching up with the political culture of the country. So the mechanisms that the constitution creates for participation, for holding people accountable in government, are not designed for mass participation. They're designed for you as one organization to kind of challenge this behemoth of the promise that your views will be taken in. And when you don't participate in that, you're then seen as undemocratic. And if you're undemocratic, you don't get the government support. So you're almost always left on the outside, which is why Abashali in particular is an amazing organization, but struggles to organize with others because it's not in their incentive structure. But it's a fascinating situation. And I think one of the prominent things, so to answer the question around institutions, I think the institutions in our country are strong, but are also being systematically defunded and systematically taken apart. So our IEC's budgets, our Electoral Commission's budget, for instance, one of the world's best electoral commissions by a long shot, have been systematically defunded over the last 10 years. We have what we call these kind of quasi-autonomous bodies, or Chapter 9 institutions. So organizations outside of the traditional state that are made to hold the state accountable. So the IEC, our Auditor General, our Human Rights Commission, all of these have been systematically defunded. Not that our budget is small, it is we're actively not giving you money. So we can see these institutions being attacked, and we can see our Constitutional Court also facing that strain but holding tight. But the institutions are holding, and it's probably the only thing that's kept the country intact, but we now know that they're easily dismantled. On the polling data, there was a question on that. I would caution everyone around any polls in South Africa, except for Ipsos and the CSIR, because they are heavily ideological. Their methods are appalling. So the latest poll that has the ANC underneath at 37%, when you just look at the methods, the idea that you don't count into your overall figures undecided voters, right? You don't publish that number at all, skews the data as a whole. And it's because of the kind of ideological bent major polling organizations have. So I would just kind of caution on that. The other one is, this will be, I think, my second last comment. The ANC is not dying. I really want to emphasize this. If the ANC were to get under 50%, it would be such an unprecedented fall, right? They would have to fall by 7%, which has never happened in their history. And there's nothing really to show us. And the ANC usually drops by 1 to 3% in an election, right? Regardless of what's happening. So it's not like corruption just started in the last 5 years, right? So over the last 15 years, there has been chaos in the country, but the ANC's decline has been steady across the board, right? So the assumption that the ANC's drop would be more than double its ordinary number to get under 50, to get under to like 37, 38 would mean a 20% drop is a fascinating, unprecedented thing. And I just think it's unlikely. And then on MK, I'm not convinced by MK, to be completely honest. When you look at what makes MK, no one can name me an MK leader outside of Zuma, essentially, right? And no one can tell me a policy of MK. MK is the last achieved by President Zuma to gain relevance in one way or another. They're extremely regionalized. They do not have support structures. They do not have infrastructure outside of one province. They will eat the ANC's lunch, though, in KZN, 100%. That will happen. Whether they make a mark on a national level is undecided, right? And we don't have any evidence to show us that they're mobilizing outside of one region. That doesn't mean they can't be influential. Their influence in KZN in particular could be used as a political football for national issues, right? And that's where their influence will come. But it's really centered around one personality, and we'll be testing that personality's support. What we do know in the ANC and in South Africa is that often leaders of the ANC think they're really, really popular until they leave. And then they realize people's support wasn't necessarily for you as a person, but for the organization itself. And the MK party will be a really true test of this. And then one last thing is, there is definitely a connection between local issues and national issues. So, but it's more because the local issues are so widespread and repetitive that it becomes a national issue. So your local issue of potholes is a national issue of potholes. Your local issue of electricity is a national issue. Your local issue of water has now become a national issue because of governance falling apart. And that's the connection that we are seeing people have. But we do know that people, when they vote, don't split their votes. They don't vote ANC national and then another party who I think can sort out my local issues. They vote ANC, but we're seeing that trend change. And I'll leave it off there. I definitely took more than 3 minutes and I apologize.
That's fine. They're all big talkers and a bit over the time, but I think you should give them a hand anyway. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chikane.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.